Hey, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. Thank you so much for joining us for this second summer school webinar series session, which is now in progress. We're going to go ahead and get started because we definitely have a very full lineup of speakers for today's content. Today's session is the future of PFAS. So thanks for joining us for WQRF's Summer School Series. I'm Callie Matheny, the Director of Operations. Also on the call today is our Research Manager, Kayla Callejas. And I want to thank definitely Calgon Carbon Corporation for sponsoring the entire summer school webinar series for free. So special thanks to Calgon for their support, as well as any other WQRF supporters who are on this call today. We are grateful to you for your support of the work we do. So quickly, a little housekeeping before we get started. As I mentioned, this is a very action-packed hour, so please make sure that you use the Q&A function for any questions you might have. We will actually do the Q&A toward the end of today's webinar session, just to kind of keep things moving. But additionally, look to your email later on in the week for a copy of the link for this particular recording. But as always, you can also find kind of our library of recorded webinars on wqrf.org/webinars. So our speakers for today, we've got Ashley Green, a physical scientist with EPA's Office of Ground and Drinking Water. Ashley's work on the development and review of the nation's drinking water rules and regulations under the Safe Water Act, including the PFAS drinking water rule. She also served as the office's special assistant, coordinating the priorities of the office, as well as serving on the Creating Resilient Water Utilities program, providing resources and technical assistance to water utilities in adapting to climate change and building resilient water infrastructure. Before her civil service career, Ashley served as a surface warfare officer in the United States Navy. Cindy Frickel is also from the EPA and is a physical scientist with the EPA's Superfund program, where she propagates technical information to site cleanup professionals through various trainings, EPA forums, and interagency channels. Recently, she led EPA's work group in updating the PFAS destruction and disposal interim guidance. David Cheriba is the president and CEO of Revive Environmental. He has a 20-year career that has been in allied chemical, materials, and environmental services industries. Prior to joining Revive, he was the vice president and general manager of Evoqua's ProAct Environmental Solutions Division, where he led the mobile remediation and granular activated carbon business. He has an MBA from the Naveen Jindal School of Management at the University of Texas at Dallas, and a bachelor's degree in chemistry from Texas A&M University. He holds 5 patents on process chemistry technology and optimization. And finally, Angela was not able to join us today, but instead we do have Adam Redding on the call from Calgon Carbon. He serves as the technical director for the Innovative Carbon Technologies and Drinking Water Solutions Division at Calgon. He obtained his PhD in environmental engineering from Penn State in 2008. And in addition to earning his master's and bachelor's degrees in environmental and civil engineering, respectively. Adam's academic journey has been dedicated to advancing the fields of drinking water treatment through his research on activated carbons. His bachelor's and master's programs, as well as his PhD studies, focus specifically on evaluating the effectiveness of activated carbons in removing endocrine disrupting and pharmaceutical compounds. Since 2008, Adam has amassed valuable expertise in the activated carbon industry, contributing his knowledge and skills to various applications in municipal, industrial, and food and beverage water treatment. So I'm going to stop talking now and turn this over to Ashley Green. Thank you.
Thanks, Callie. Let me know if you can't hear me. I'm just going to assume that you all can. So hi, everyone. My name is Ashley Green. As Callie said, I work in EPA's Office of Groundwater and Drinking Water. I'm one of the technical leads for the PFAS National Primary Drinking Water Regulation effort, but did work with a very large team at EPA in the development of this rule. And so definitely appreciate the opportunity to come and share some information during this webinar and provide a pretty high-level summary of the National Primary Drinking Water Regulation that was promulgated this past February. All right, so next slide, please. So I'll take a couple slides to really just focus on some high-level background and the importance of this regulation. So the agency has reviewed all of the best available health effects information, and from that, we do know that exposure to PFAS over long periods of time can cause cancer and other serious illnesses. We also know that during critical life stages like pregnancy and early childhood, this can have negative impacts on human health as well. And we've seen through our environmental justice evaluations that PFAS pollution can have disproportionate impacts on certain communities, those like small, disadvantaged, and rural communities that already may be facing challenges with other sources of contamination or other types of environmental issues. And so collectively, that's why EPA has taken this action and leveraged all of this information to set the national standards for certain PFAS in drinking water. Next slide, please. So as I just mentioned, after years of not only reviewing this best available science on how PFAS affects public health, but also after really engaging with our stakeholders in the water utility sector and state and tribal co-regulators, we want to ensure effective implementation of this rule. So that engagement that we held included that during the development of the final rule, the agency did review and consider over 120,000 public comments on the proposed rule, of which some of you attending today's webinar may have submitted. So thank you for sharing your information and your perspectives. And I can definitely assure you that the agency did review and consider all of these comments that ultimately has led to a rule that will reduce PFAS exposures for approximately 100 million people, prevent thousands of deaths, and reduce tens of thousands of serious illnesses associated with PFAS exposure. Next slide, please. So now turning to a few quick slides on what the actual regulation requires. So within this National Primary Drinking Water Regulation, EPA has established non-enforceable public health goals, and those are also called maximum contaminant level goals, or MCLGs, as well as legally enforceable standards, and those are referred to as maximum contaminant levels, or MCLs. And this is for 6 PFAS that are known to occur individually and or as part of mixtures in drinking water. So first, I'll share some information about the maximum contaminant level goals, those non-enforceable goals. So for PFOA and PFOS, EPA has set those levels at 0 because those 2 compounds are likely to cause cancer and there's no level of exposure to them without a risk of human health impacts. EPA has also set individual MCLGs for 3 other PFAS individually, and those include PFNA, PFHXS, and HFPO dimer acid, which is also commonly referred to as Gen X chemicals, and each of those MCLGs are 10 parts per trillion. Next slide, please. So now turning to the enforceable standards for the individual contaminants, or those MCLs, and those will apply to public water systems throughout the country. So for PFOA and PFOS, EPA has set their MCLs at 4.0 parts per trillion each. And this is a level that will reduce exposure in drinking water to the lowest level that's feasible for effective implementation. So the MCLG is set at 0 and the enforceable level is at 4.0 parts per trillion because that is what's feasible. Now for PFNA, PFHXS, and HFPO-DA, the Safe Drinking Water Act does restate that an MCL should be set as close as feasible to an MCLG. And so in those cases, we are setting their MCLs at a level equal to their MCLGs, and each of those are at 10 parts per trillion. Next slide, please. So in this regulation, in addition to the 5 individual MCLs and MCLGs I was just describing, EPA is also regulating mixture combinations of 4 PFAS. And those 4 PFAS include PFHXS, PFNA, HFPO-DA, and PFBS. And this is through a hazard index approach. And we took this approach because in reviewing years of research, it's shown that some of these chemicals, including these 4 PFAS, can combine and co-occur in mixtures in different types of combinations within drinking water and have additive health effects. So essentially that means that individually they may not pose a health concern, at lower levels, but when they're combined in mixtures, and even when present at those lower levels, the mixture of the PFAS may pose the health concern, again, due to those additive health effects. Next slide, please. So just to share a bit more information around the hazard index, as this might be a new thing for some folks. So it is a long established approach that's been used in other EPA programs like Superfund to determine the health concerns associated with exposure to chemical mixtures. So if you take a look at the equation on the slide, the hazard index, it's made up of a sum of fractions or ratios that are calculated by first dividing the exposure or the measured concentration of each of those 4 PFAS by their individual health-based water concentration level. And that's a level below which health effects are not anticipated. You can see that for PFNA, PFHXS, and HFPO-DA, those health-based water concentrations are each 10 parts per trillion, and for PFBS, it's 2,000 parts per trillion. So after each of the individual PFAS ratios are calculated, they are then added together to produce a hazard index value. And then when looking at compliance with the hazard index MCL, that standard is set such that a mixture containing 2 or more of these 4 PFAS cannot exceed a hazard index value of 1. And I do encourage you to take a look at our PFAS drinking water regulation website. I'll share the link to that at the end of this presentation, but there's a lot of available information on all different aspects of the rule. In particular, there's a fact sheet on the hazard index if you want to see more information on it, as well as example calculations. Next slide, please. I'm not going to restate all of this information, as I know you'll have it for reference, but just to put it all on one slide, we've got all of the maximum contaminant levels and the maximum contaminant level goals listed for those 5 individual PFAS, as well as the hazard index or the mixtures of 2 or more of those 4 PFAS. Next slide, please. So a few quick highlights on other requirements of the rule outside of those maximum contaminant levels and the MCLGs. So public water systems, specifically community water systems and non-transient, non-community water systems, are required to take actions which do include conducting initial and ongoing drinking water monitoring for the regulated PFAS. And if after conducting this monitoring and determining compliance and levels violate 1 or more of the MCLs, the systems would be required to find solutions to reduce the level below the standards, to at or below the standards, which can include both treatment and non-treatment approaches. Another requirement is that water systems are required to inform their consumers of the measured levels of these regulated PFAS and any exceedances of the PFAS in their drinking water, and also notify them if there is an MCL that is violated. Next slide, please. So a couple more slides just related more specifically to treatment and implementation associated with the treatment aspects. So regarding actions that water systems may need to take to address those violations of 1 or more MCLs, it's really important that I'm clear that the final rule does not dictate how a water system is required to remove these PFAS. They only need to comply with the maximum contaminant levels. However, in the rule, EPA does outline several best available treatment technologies, as well as compliance technologies for small systems. All of these have been demonstrated to effectively remove the regulated PFAS in drinking water to the MCLs. And those technologies can include those such as sorptive technologies like granular activated carbon, membrane technologies like reverse osmosis, and ion exchange systems. I'll also note that in addition to treatment, some water systems may also elect to take on non-treatment approaches like closing down a contaminated well or obtaining a new drinking water source that is uncontaminated. Next slide, please. And then just a few other items related to drinking water treatment. It is really important. I'm sure many of you know that a lot of these drinking water treatment technologies that are available for PFAS will also remove other contaminants like disinfection byproducts. And I'll note that related to point of use and point of entry devices, while they have been demonstrated to significantly reduce PFAS concentrations, They are not currently third-party certified to meet all of the regulatory standards in this rule, and they do not meet the requirements under the Safe Drinking Water Act related to small system compliance technologies. However, once and if these third-party standards are updated to achieve all of the MCLs, they would meet the requirements of the regulation, and that may be particularly useful for some small water systems. And then the last thing I'll just really briefly mention is that to help support providing information on the handling and disposal of PFAS treatment residuals, concurrent with this drinking water rule, we did release an updated version of the PFAS destruction and disposal guidance. My colleague Cindy, who's going to be speaking very shortly, is going to be providing more information related to this guidance and the management of PFAS residuals. Next slide, please. So with that overview, it was very quick. I do encourage you to take a look at this website. A lot more information, a lot more detailed information. And I just want to thank you for your time today. I think with that, Callie, I'm going to turn it over to Cindy.
Thanks, Ashley. So as Ashley mentioned, EPA has this new PFAS MCL out, but we don't dictate in the MCL how or with what technology water systems should remove PFAS. So I'm going to share a little bit about our interim guidance on destruction and disposal today. And I also want to mention there's another recent EPA action where we published a final rule designating PFOA and PFAS as hazardous substances under CERCLA, the Superfund rule. And I'll just mention that this rule as well doesn't require waste to be treated in a particular way or disposed of at a specific type of landfill. So what's in this guidance that I'll be describing is just kind of a compendium of best practices for how to manage these types of wastes. So it was conveniently timed that we put out an update of this guidance concurrently with the MCL. But this guidance actually came about in late 2019 and 2020, where Congress required EPA to publish interim guidance on destruction and disposal of PFAS. And this was tailored to specifically 6 types of PFAS containing materials. And I'll show those in just a moment. But we, in this guidance, were to consider potential for PFAS releases that might impact potentially vulnerable populations that live near destruction and disposal sites, and also to provide guidance on testing and monitoring for releases near these sites. Part of what Congress required was for us to update this interim guidance at least every 3 years. So I mentioned that it's called interim guidance. We are not planning to make it go final in the foreseeable future. So we will continue to update this every 3 years. And as we all know, PFAS science is really evolving. So I think this is appropriate for us to do so. So if you go to the next slide, please. Okay, so these are the 6 types of PFAS containing materials that were identified by Congress. So these are the ones that we focus on in our interim guidance. But I think the technologies and practices that are outlined in the guidance can be applied to other materials as well. For this particular presentation, I'll focus on number 4 here, which includes water treatment residuals, filters, membranes, resins, GAC, things that folks on this call are probably fairly familiar with. Let's go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so in this guidance, we laid out the different types of PFAS containing materials. What are the types of technologies that would be applicable to those materials? What are some emerging technologies that are coming out? Mostly these are in the destruction realm. And then also how to assess impacts of releases on communities, and what are EPA's research programs doing, and what are some of our needs to update this guidance more in the future. For the destruction disposal technologies, we focused on ones that were widely available, and I'll talk a little more about these. So thermal treatment, landfilling, and underground injection are the main ones in the guidance. Next slide, please. So for drinking water treatment specifically, this is a table straight out of the guidance. So you can refer to this table and see for which types of materials you have to manage, what are the destruction or disposal options that might be available to you. And then this would just refer to that section in the guidance. So we'll have this in here for your reference, and I'll just go to the next slide. Okay, so briefly, the types of destruction disposal methods that are available for drinking water treatment residuals. Underground injection might be available or applicable for ion exchange regenerant brines. So this would be, you would need to use a permitted deep injection well, class 1 well, and you could use either hazardous or non-hazardous materials type wells for that. I'll go ahead and skip to the next slide since I want to try and keep us on schedule. For landfilling, this might be applicable for management of granulated or powdered activated carbon, or perhaps for that ion exchange spent resin. So there's some new research that we've seen. This is in the guidance that shows that how PFAS might migrate out of a landfill is impacted by the type of PFAS. So for example, if it's stable or volatile, it's also impacted by the components of the mixed waste. So if there are organic or biodegradable components in the waste, that might cause PFAS to volatilize or otherwise be able to be released into air or groundwater. So there's ongoing research in this area. And I've got some of these research areas that are listed here. I'll go ahead and go on to the next slide, please. Thermal treatment, this might apply to regeneration of activated carbon or for ion exchange spent resins. So there is very little research in this area that looks at how well PFAS or what temperature PFAS is destroyed in hazardous waste combustors. There's been one very recent EPA study that observed where we had a specific set of conditions were met that PFAS was destroyed well. There are other folks that are doing research in this area. We have some new analytical methods that are out from EPA that will help us better characterize. And so on the next slide, I've got a little bit more. So we're looking more at specifically what temperatures are needed to completely destroy PFAS. What are the types of products of incomplete combustion that might be formed and what are they? And we're looking more at what types of emission controls are needed in order to ensure that PFAS is not being released into the environment. So there is a new portion in the interim guidance this year that has a test plan that can be used by thermal treatment facilities. And that would look at ensuring that no products of incomplete combustion are being released to the atmosphere. Next slide, please. So in 2020, in our initial version of this guidance, we strongly suggested putting PFAS-containing materials into interim storage until more was known about some of the uncertainties with these technologies. We have learned quite a bit since that time, so we aren't pushing for interim storage so much now. We are saying that it may still be appropriate in some situations. So for example, if all of these criteria are met, if it doesn't need to be destroyed right away, if there's capacity for on-site storage, and if proper controls are in place to ensure that PFAS isn't being released into the environment, then it might make sense to store PFAS-containing materials. So this is most appropriate if you have, like, for example, a low volume of containerized materials, or if you have containerized high concentration PFAS materials. Next slide, please. So in addition to these three technologies and storage that I've just discussed, there are, of course, new technologies that are coming online. I mentioned that we aren't requiring any use of any specific PFAS technologies to meet these MCLs. And I just want to stress that EPA actually encourages using innovative technologies, but we would like folks to prioritize the use of technologies that have a lower potential to release PFAS into the environment. So what we have provided in this new version of the guidance is a technology evaluation framework. This can be used to help evaluate what is the potential for releases based on the types of materials that contain PFAS that are being managed. And this looks at, you can kind of fill it out based on what types of materials you have, looking at what technologies are available to you, what analytical methods are available, how well does this technology work, how might the communities in the area feel about this technology being used, and are there any regulatory requirements that are in place for that technology. So this can be used both by folks to assess what type of technology to use, and also we hope that vendors will use this as an outline for information sharing. That is my last slide. I just want to mention that the guidance right now is open for public comment again. So if you have any questions about that, please contact me. Otherwise, I will pass it over to our next speaker. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. David Trable with Revive Environmental, and next slide, we'll talk about today 3 aspects related to drinking water and PFAS management. First, why destruction? The second would be evaluating your options, not only on disposal, but destruction, knowing where you're at today, what you want to achieve, and then the considerations on that journey. Lastly, we'll take you through a guided tour of what the state of Ohio is doing with us when it relates to their AFFF stockpiles, and how the destruction journey for the state for getting rid of their AFFF used a lot of the principles that we'll talk about today. So next slide. Taking a look for just a minute at the history, I think it's important to contextualize that destruction technology has really been in the works for about the last 10 years. Back when Robert Billett was doing his thing on the farms in West Virginia with the Tennant family, to the health studies in the 2000 to 2008 timeframe. My parent company, Battelle Memorial Institute, was involved with the health management of that large study. And Battelle realized back in those days that it was important to start monitoring, and of all the different challenges for environmental management, PFAS is going to be one that really is going to be a high impact over the next 30 years. So with many companies, not just Revive Environmental, but several of us really started in the 2016 to 18 timeframe, thinking about ways to destroy PFAS. And in short, you need high energy and a focus of that energy to destroy the molecule. So there's a lot of different technologies we'll speak about today that are in flight. Whether they're fully ready or not is something that we'll talk about a little bit today. And then the EPA started really after the DoD got started in 2018, 2021. The EPA announced several things that our speakers talked about today in terms of the holistic agency approach and the drinking water roadmap. And then just recently in 2023, we started to see a lot of settlements. The one from 3M, the one from BASF, several from some of the producers. And the investment for the federal government in accelerating these projects through the ESTCP US ACE is definitely accelerating. So there's a lot of investment and time into getting technologies that can help with the disposal options going. Let's talk about the next slide. What do we think there? Go ahead and click through, Callie, the different options here, 1, 2, and 3. So as we look at the PFAS cycle for a minute, let's table for this discussion the fact that we're going to continue to use PFAS. There is an effort to remove PFAS out of use cases so that we as a society use less. Let's just for now not talk about that and talk about where PFAS is in the cycle and how removal and destruction of can really make change in the cycle. First is going to be before it enters the environment, whether it's the AFFF foam that's going to be used in an oil and gas location or a fire-based or fuel-based fire at an airport, as well as the factories that either use PFAS or that produce the PFAS. We're going to need to intercept that at the tailpipe before it gets into the environment. Second, prior to wastewater, there are what we call secondary receivers, like landfills, like wastewater treatment facilities, that because of the normal course of their operation, PFAS is going to be affecting their operations. How do these secondary receivers manage the wastewater that have PFAS in that? And then third and foremost, what Ashley talked about is how do we take care of PFAS in the drinking water? And the EPA has established guidelines. Prior to the EPA establishing the MCLs in April, many states like Michigan, New Hampshire, New York, New Jersey have promulgated state-driven maximum contaminant levels. And so the nice thing about the US now is that there's a national standard for publicly available drinking water. And so we have to treat it, but we also have to consider what do we do with that PFAS once we've captured it in the various technologies. Next slide. So let's talk for a minute about the applications between 1, 2, and 3. And well, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but the purpose is to give you a view of the different considerations by application. Going from left to right, just stay on the application row for a minute. Airports have very small volumes, relatively speaking, but high concentrations with their AFFF. They need one-time projects to dispose of the AFFF, and then they have the new foam put into their fire trucks. Industrial wastewater and landfills have what I would call medium volumes of waste, anywhere between 10,000 gallons to maybe even 500,000 gallons a day of volume. And I would say on the concentration side, you're talking low part per billion to weight percent based upon if it's an industrial waste facility. The needs of those are going to be on-site or off-site disposal. With higher volumes, you're going to need concentration. And then there's an aspect of one-time versus recurring treatment in those. And then talking about the municipal water application, we are talking about orders of magnitude of additional greater volumes of water. So 5 to 20 million gallons per day of production. Ground and surface water are typically the sources. And these are relatively low concentrations, anywhere between 5 and 120 part per trillion, based on the what I call flavors of PFAS that Ashley had mentioned earlier. And there's a need for ongoing treatment, not only on the on-site side, but also on the disposal end. So what are the requirements? I'm going to highlight in blue what I believe are really important that customers are telling us. For airports, they need a turnkey project, somebody to actually manage the project for them. It's a one-off project for them. They need expertise to do cradle to grave management of that project. For industrial wastewater, they are really looking at integrated treatment chain solutions. It's not just one technology, it's how to treat the entire portfolio of their waste treatment requirements. And typically you're going to integrate into their treatment chain on the back end of their facilities. The other aspect is both with industrial wastewater and landfills, it's how do we enable permit compliance for continuing operation? And that's really important with landfills. I'll give a case in point. In Michigan, this past year, the Great Lakes Water District actually issued an edict where landfills that had been disposing of landfill leachate to the Great Lakes Watershed District are now not able to do so until they take care of the PFAS in that discharge. And so that's not a permit mod, that's an acceptance criteria that the POTWs are asking of the issuers of that leachate. So not just permits are being changed here, it's also what's being accepted. And from a destruction standpoint, some people want just good enough to manage their compliance. Others need complete solutions to manage the liability. And then we get into drinking water. There are state and federal maximum contaminant levels dictating what you do. The choice between what you do after you've captured the PFAS is really up to the individual operator. People have really talked to us as Revive around what's the lifetime management of their liability. And do you need proof of destruction in that journey? Typically it's done as a service and then they purchase the media and the tanks, but the disposal is done as a service. So go to the next slide and we'll talk about, just for a minute, some of the considerations as we talk about application choice selection. You've got to consider your scenario. Not only is it the type of waste, whether it's liquid or solid, but also the volumetric concerns we just talked about, the relative concentrations, but also what's in the water besides PFAS. And that determines whether you're going to have an in situ or inline treatment or something else where you're going to do something offline and then continue on the treatment chain. Then there's the treatment options around concentration, like reverse osmosis, granular activated carbon or ion exchange, foam frac. For soils, you're going to have soil washing and thermal treatment. But then the disposal options really are at the tail end of, okay, now what? We have PFAS in a form. What do we do with the PFAS in order to remove it from the application of interest? And there are the traditional D&D options that have been talked about: landfill, depot, inject, and on-site storage, the thermal treatments that we talked about and that Calgon will speak to later. And then there are these other destruction options, which I'll speak to today, that have, I believe, some really interesting application for intentional PFAS destruction. Next slide. So taking a little bit of the EPA's view on guidance, there's really 6 areas of what I would call criteria the EPA has come up with for new technologies. Is the technology ready now with scale? Is it effective in the application for broad and complete mineralization? How good is it at destroying? What materials are you thinking about? The community environmental justice impact. Are you permitted in multiple locations? And then the analytical, prove the fact that you've destroyed the PFAS with the US EPA mandated methods. The next, push the button one more time here. There are some questions that were raised just on the traditional methods of disposal that the EPA is going to continue to ask questions of. And the way that I've seen customers engage the destruction guidance is really that this is a broad framework for anybody that has an application for PFAS destruction to go through intentionally and ask the questions, whether it's a traditional disposal and destruct service or one of the newer destruction models. Next slide. So as you're evaluating your project, I think it's important to go from the upper left-hand quadrant clockwise to destruction and through that. So design considerations. What is your operating requirements? What are your co-contaminants? The entire scope of the project. Many people start with the end in mind, which is, what is my deployment and my destruction disposal options? Most people start a project saying, do we want to just contain the PFAS? Or do we want to move it to the next phase of the value chain? Or do we want to insert some type of a destruction option where we have documented destruction as a service or as a purchase? And so thinking about the disposal options, I think, is really important when you consider a holistic approach to your PFAS management. And then ultimately, you're going to need to consider what your deployment strategy is. Do you have the resources in order to execute this and buy the technology? Or are you going to outsource this as a service? What we have found at Revive is that outsourcing the disposal of PFAS as a service is the most scalable way to get people economically accessing the technology that we offer. And so we provide both on-site and off-site services to use that model. The next slide. One of the things that I think is really important as we consider PFAS as a service is really the scenario around destruction. I call your attention to the light blue boxes to the right. In each scenario, you're going to see a difference of, do we completely mineralize the PFAS and destroy it completely? Or is there some level of either a breakdown of the PFAS into smaller pieces, smaller chains that need to be managed from a release standpoint? In the scenario where you're completely mineralizing, you have a fully contained, what I call closed loop option. With scenario 2, whether you're concentrating and then there's some remnant of PFAS left over, you're going to need to recycle that or manage it somehow with either a GAC or an ion exchange polish in order to completely eliminate the discharge of that PFAS from the treatment chain. But making sure that you're really aware of the technology's capability to not only break down the PFAS, but are you really getting full mineralization or just breaking it down into other non-targeted PFAS molecules is important. The other thing that we've seen is that some technologies have unintended consequences for producing other contaminants of concern that do need to be managed with eyes wide open to make sure that you are truly doing the job of removing PFAS without adding additional concerns of contaminants. And then I think for this group, just the water industry, media is likely going to be what you're going to do for water treatment, the GAC and ion exchange, and then how do you deal with that solid waste and other ways, whether it's in situ regeneration or the thermal reactivation, landfill incineration that will be talked about at the end of this webinar. Next slide. So let's go into a case study. Here's our Columbus facility that we're commissioning this week to support this case study for AFFF destruction of the state of Ohio's stockpiles. Next slide. Let's talk about where the state was. 3 years ago, the state approached Battelle prior to the Revive Environmental spinout with an opportunity to not use incineration, landfill, or deep well injection and remove completely the PFAS burden from the taxpayers of the state of Ohio. And so where Ohio came to about 6 months ago in October of 2023, they approached Battelle and Revive with, your technology works, you're permitted. Let's have you do a turnkey receipt of foam from the firefighters around the state and provide full destruction as a service at one of your locations. So we decided to build a facility in Columbus that has 3 of our PFAS annihilators, and we're getting great results so far. We've opened the registration to all firefighting brigades in the state. We have about 350 fire stations registered so far. And to date, we've got over 70,000 gallons of foam registered for pickup. We've executed about 15,000 gallons of pickup so far to date, as of today. And our new Columbus facility is now in operation as of this morning with our first run of PFAS destruction there. Taking a look at the why, here's why the state of Ohio really looked at us. Next slide, please. They looked at their standards in the bottom left. And if we think about the journey I just described, you need to think about your holistic plan and what your targets are. And they knew that they had the water action levels for the state drinking water. The EPA guidance had been flagged in October, but not issued yet when we got the contract. But we also showed them as a destruction partner, here's our ability to destroy the various compounds. Here's our volumes and our capabilities and our permits. And really, we channeled the EPA destruction guidance, even though it hadn't come out yet, with the updated destruction guidance considerations. And we evidenced to them with analytical, with data, the permits, the applications of AFFF, that we were both capable and qualified to do that. And here you see the results. I'll call your attention to a few numbers on the right. PFHXA, 75 million part per trillion. We're routinely getting that down to essentially non-detect at single-digit part per trillion levels. Regardless of the type of compound and the starting concentration, we're able to achieve relatively complete destruction. You'll see that we started at 188 part per trillion with 6.2 FDS. We got it to 22. I'd say that's still 6 nines of destruction and well below the health guidance for that particular analyte. So we feel pretty comfortable with our ability to execute AFFF, and that leads us to other applications as well that we'll be working on in the field. Last slide is here. This is just the criteria. So as you're thinking about your journey, whether it's disposal of media, disposal of a liquid waste or a solid waste that contains PFAS, I would encourage you to look at technology, materials, analytical, the efficacy of the destruction, the community impact, and the regulatory. I do confirm today that PFAS Annihilator is ready and able to meet all the new EPA criteria, and we're ready to go with different applications. The last slide here is just our team. You know, this is a person journey here, and we wouldn't be talking on this webinar about PFAS if it didn't impact health and safety of our people. So we've got people behind this technology. There are others that are at your firms right now wanting to make a difference. And it is truly the people that makes the difference. So thank you. I will turn it over to my representative from Calgon, Adam.
All right, thank you very much, David. Let me get my video rolling here. Okay, looks like I'm live. So we were asked to speak about how within the realm of activated carbon use in particular, GAC reactivation can be applied for PFAS destruction. And additionally here, as the title says, some cost savings. And I realize that this isn't exactly immediately relevant to POU or POE applications, but want to show how this currently functions within a municipal market with larger quantities of carbon And of course, I'm sure some questions are going to pop up here with regard to how this really could be done, in particular, probably for a point of entry application where we're talking about larger volumes of material. So I'm going to talk about activated carbon a little bit without beating that one to death, and about the reactivation process, probably where that's the most interesting to anyone on this webinar. A quick case study, just looking at how these costs play out over a municipal size application, and then of course open it up for questions and discussions. And if I'm not mistaken, I'm the last presenter today. So to talk a little bit about activated carbon, one of the key things, and I think this is really where perhaps at Calgon I could say we've been lucky, just because of the source material that we've chosen when the company was actually started, or at least had its foundations in the 40s in the war effort. And that is the use of bituminous coal sourced here in the United States to make the activated carbon. And why did that happen? That happened because during the Second World War, the source of coconuts, which were then used predominantly to make activated carbon from coconut shell char, were really just, well, not available because they were tied up in the islands that were quite involved in the war and occupation. But in short, we were tasked at that time with finding a method by which we could make an activated carbon that could be used in a respirator, because these were respirator applications. So a gas phase application like you'd have in a military use. But in short, we were tasked with making a material that could be used in a vapor phase respirator application. And it was really over time that these then evolved into the activated carbons that you would use today in drinking water treatment. But where I say that we've been lucky, or really had some stroke of luck, whatever you want to look at it, but short of it is, with the bituminous-based material and a PFAS application, the two work well, or quite well together. And that really comes down to the images that you see here on the right-hand side of the slide, where you have to consider that when the contaminant is moving through the packed bed of media, of course, it's diffusing through the water, and then it encounters the surface of the carbon. It's really the last two steps in there, which are this pore and surface diffusion. And within that image, I'd say really, in my academic opinion, I'd probably reverse those two. But the key thing there is how quickly these contaminants can be removed. And where that's especially important for PFAS is that the PFAS contaminants, as David was just covering there, in the concentrations are extremely low. So what it comes down to is that it's not the actual capacity of the activated carbon that dictates the performance, it's how quickly you can actually get that contaminant into the structure. And is that new to what we know about activated carbon? No, actually not. And as long as we've been trying to treat other contaminants that occur at PPT levels, if any of you are in California, perhaps the Central Valley, you'll know about trichloropropane, which is regulated there at PPT levels. You could even talk about other issues that our customers might face, like taste and odor, where you're looking at methyl isobornyl or geosmin, which humans can pick up at, I think at least 2 PPT for a lot of people, particularly sensitive to it myself. But it's this last step in the process, the diffusion into the structure, that is what gives the bituminous-based material its advantage. And this is something we've learned over time, and really how the market has tended to go towards these bituminous coal-based materials that have a superior performance for PFAS removal. So again, we've been it's been fortuitous that we've been producing this material for many decades now, and it just works quite well. It's in many ways you could call it the jack of all trades, so to speak. When we look at the structure and we look more closely, there's a gazillion ways you can depict this. This is probably the most rudimentary depiction that I could apply here, but it might get the message across to the audience. And that is that when you have the starting material, often, in fact, almost always when it comes down to economics, it's the starting material's initial structure that will determine the final structure. And I say almost always because, as well, we know economics drives everything, but there are a lot of ways you can modify material, but there are a few ways that you can do it in an economical manner. That last point on this slide is really the key point, and this gets back to what I was saying on the last slide about the PFAS removal, is that it comes down to this mass transport rate in structure. And really that first point there, the highways. So we have what we call transport pores, and we have absorption pores. The bituminous-based material is lucky that it has a good balance of those, so that we have a rapid diffusion in the structure. And then we have the parking lots, or the absorption pores, then, that can hold up the PFAS contaminant and keep it bound within that structure. This is really what it all comes down to. And there's various starting materials, but we found that when we look across the spectrum of the PFAS contaminants, because we've got some that are on the lower molecular weight and some are on the middle, of course, higher. But you really want a material that can cover that range as best as possible. And that's not saying that activated carbon can remove all the PFAS contaminants in an economical manner, but what we're lucky is that those that seem to be the most toxic are also the most readily removed by an absorption mechanism. Does the type of PFAS impact bed life? Heck yes, most definitely. This is not, and this is where I think it's most we have to take a step back and realize that PFAS may be new to us, or new, let's say, within the last decade, at least our knowledge of the ubiquity of these compounds and the toxicity. But as long as these have existed in the environment, if you've been applying an activated carbon, you've been removing some of the PFAS compounds, perhaps some more than others, but they've always been absorbing in the material, just like any organic contaminant has some predilection to absorb on the activated carbon. When you look at the structure, again, nothing really new here from what we knew from a chemistry standpoint, geez, probably 100 years ago. And that is that as the size of the molecule changes and as the solubility of the molecule changes, you're changing the absorbability of that molecule. So in short, if it's a smaller or lower molecular weight compound, let's say like perfluorobutane sulfonic acid or PFBS, or the carboxylate version, PFBA, or perfluorobutanoic acid, these are going to be more difficult to remove because they're smaller, meaning they have less to interact with the carbon surface for the absorption mechanism. And they're also going to be more water soluble because they're smaller, they're easier to solvate, they require less energy to fit into that packet of water and remain there. When we look at the breakdown and how these are removed through the activated carbon, if someone had told me that these were the compounds 10 years ago before you were ever able to detect them, or really told anyone that knew anything about carbon, you could pretty easily have ranked these right then and there as to how removable they would be. So what does that mean? If we look more closely at this figure in particular, if you look at PFBA, again, the perfluorobutanoic acid, 4 carbons in the chain, carboxylate, you see that it has relatively immediate breakthrough. This is, of course, not necessarily good, but the positive thing here, at least, is from a toxicity perspective and from what we know about the half-life in the human body, relatively short for those compounds, or that compound in particular. Looking at this figure down below, you can, if you go through it and parse it out compound by compound, see that as the molecular weight increases, and if it's a sulfonate, it's more readily removable, but short, higher molecular weight, easier to remove on the activated carbon. That last note on the slide here, this is also observed in other medias, like ion exchange resins see the same thing. A little bit different though, because the sulfonate on the ion exchange material is much more preferred than the carboxylate functionality. But when you look at it and you break it down by molecular weight, you'll see the same separation because there's also an absorption mechanism there to the removal and the binding on the resin bead or the plastic bead that contains the functionality for the ion exchange. If you take away anything from this, I would say it's that the carboxylates break through before the sulfonates of the same chain length. And I've got to back that up a little bit too, because if you're a chemist, you would know that if it's PFBA, one of those carbons is in the carboxylate, in the COOH or COO minus with the carboxylate. And so it's really a 3-carbon chain with the carboxylate, where when you talk about the sulfonate, PFBS, for example, the comparison, it's a 4-carbon chain with the sulfonate group. So it's not exactly apples to apples there, and keep that in mind when we talk about removal capacity. So to the question here about reactivated carbon, can reactivated carbon still remove PFAS? Absolutely, yes. One of the things that we see in these applications, because they are typically in low background contaminant strength waters, I mean in that the TOC or total organic carbon of the water is typically quite low in groundwaters, which are containing PFAS. You could say a typical number is going to be less than 1 ppm TOC, perhaps less than 0.5 ppm. What this means is that while the carbon is removing the PFAS compounds or absorbing the PFAS compounds, it's not building up a large concentration of other organics. So when it goes in for thermal reactivation, you don't have to spend a lot of time driving off those other organics. And it means that the structure of the material, that it returns to very near what it was in the starting process. This figure here is an interesting one for me, because it really illustrates the difference here when you look at CMR, or custom municipal reactivated carbon, and virgin. And you might look at that and question, wow, it's reactivated carbon. and think about it from the used car perspective. Remember when we started calling used cars pre-owned because used didn't sound so good? This is a similar idea here, in that you have to keep in mind that just because it's been used before and reactivated doesn't mean that it's actually going to have, so to speak, more miles on it. And what we see in this figure here is that the reactivated material is actually outperforming slightly the virgin material. And that gets back to the highway thing that I was talking about earlier. When you go through the reactivation process, you actually cause some additional burnout of the porosity. But that additional burnout is actually advantageous because it creates new or wider transport pores, where now the mass transport into the structure is faster. With PFAS, because again, very small concentrations, we're not loading a lot of mass into the material. That is really an advantageous change, to add in or increase the amount of transport pores or the size of the transport pores and increase that mass transport rate. And that's really what you're seeing here. Another thing you're seeing in this figure, and it's interesting too, is that of course these other materials that are made, or other carbons that are made from other starting materials, have some PFAS capacity, but we're in a good spot here with the reagglomerated bituminous material, because it tends to be, if not the best performer, on par with any other material we've seen or used or applied for PFAS removal. But with the reactivation process, we can continuously produce a very high quality reactivated material. One question that may come up in the chat here is, how many times can you reactivate it? Essentially, at this level, you can reactivate it indefinitely, because you're always adding a little bit of what we call makeup material. That amount may be 10%, maybe 20%. But as you're handling the carbon, removing it from the vessel, running it through the kiln, you're going to lose some of the carbon to attrition. You're going to lose some of it due to the fact that as it is handled, you get smaller pieces, fragments, but you'll have to add some makeup material. But as you do that, you can keep cycling this almost indefinitely. We say, if you want to put a number on it, 5 to 10 times, but if you keep adding makeup, it really is almost indefinite. So main question here, huge question: what happens during reactivation? This is certainly a question that we posed to ourselves many times at Calgon, because of the number of facilities we operate that offer this process. We started, actually, when I moved to Calgon back in 2018, we started talking about this with the US EPA. I went through a lot of discussions as to how we would handle such an evaluation of a facility. At some point, it really became, as some would say, too many cooks in the kitchen. So we went out on our own, and of course hired a company to do the stack sampling, et cetera, but wanted to look at a reactivation process. And this one in particular, an industrial reactivation process, is where we started, because that's where we could apply or attempt to reactivate an activated carbon that had the highest loading of PFAS coming out of another industrial application. You know, back to David's slide earlier, looking at the drinking water applications, you're talking about numbers that are in tens, maybe in some cases hundreds of PPT. When you talk about industrial remediation, like a groundwater remediation closer to a source, you can have much higher loadings. So out of the study that we conducted, what we saw ultimately was 99.99% destruction. So a 4-log destruction of the PFAS compounds that we could measure at that time. We are still, and I apologize, there were other slides shown previously with the OTM or other test methods. There are new test methods where we can evaluate some more of the lighter or lower molecular weight PFAS compounds, and that's what we're moving through now. And I'm going to walk through this here pretty quickly just to show you what the study looked like and where the sampling points were in the process. But you're looking at destructive removal. This is the DRE, the destructive removal efficiency, which is basically in over out over the input to give you a percentage of destruction. Within the process of reactivation, and this is really a snapshot of what goes on, we have to keep in mind that everything shown on the left, which is a depiction of a multiple hearth kiln, where you've got different levels that you can keep at different temperatures with different gas compositions. Carbon starts at the top, works its way through the bottom by motion of rabble arms in there. But that entire process on the left is meant to restore the activated carbon structure. It's not exactly intended to destroy the contaminants that are on it, but to remove them and see that when the carbon comes out the back end, there's no detectable contaminant remaining on it, and that structure of the activated carbon is restored to as near virgin or perhaps better than it started. And this always becomes a question, or maybe a hurdle for some people, where they look at that like that is the destructive part. We certainly do see destruction in there, but it's not the primary goal of the reactivation kiln or furnace. It's to restore the activated carbon. It's everything that you see on the right, where you go through a thermal oxidizer, a dry chemical scrubber, baghouse for particulate capture, and then finally out the exhaust stack. That's the pollution abatement system. That is specifically designed to make sure that what comes off of the activated carbon should not be destroyed in the reactivation. Again, which is not the primary goal of that part of the process, but if it's not destroyed, you want to be able to make sure that it's either destroyed or captured in those next steps in the process. So when we look at these and we try to break down what we're seeing for removal, it comes down to, we've got to look at solids extraction off of both the spent carbon coming in to know what's coming in. We got to look at reactivation to know what's coming out, and then look at the vapor coming out, look at the liquid captured off of the vapor as with some condensate, looking at the chemical scrubber for anything that's captured in there on, in this case, it's a dry scrubber, baghouse for the particulates, see what's off of that. But there's multiple points of exit with one point of entry, the point of entry being the spent carbon, and all these points of exit being on different solid materials or in different liquid phases. A lot of numbers here. I would say you could stare at them, but you can look at the quick math down at the bottom, which is the most important thing, at least makes me feel a little bit better, or say a lot better about what we do at Calgon. We look at the total PFAS compounds, everything we could detect at that time. I believe there are 29 in the list for the set of data. 4 log destruction there. If we look specifically at those that are under the EPA regulation, we're looking at 5 log destruction. So a very positive outcome for this type of facility. Of course, we're looking more at our other facilities too, but this was the first study that we undertook, and this is actually published in the Journal of Hazardous Materials. And I breeze through this really quickly just to the end, because I know I'm getting a little short on time. When we look at reactivation, when we look at it at a municipal level, one thing to keep in mind is that if you're trying to do a representative load, you need at least 10,000 pounds, preferably 20, because any smaller amount than that, you really can't fill the kiln like you need to. But you could say on average, at least in this application, when you're looking at different levels of PFAS removal, whether on the middle bullet point, you're looking at just the regulated PFAS, or you're looking at all PFAS, you can save about 20%. And that's pretty common. It can be plus or minus one way or the other, depending upon how that system is operated. But key thing there, I would say, is if you are trying to remove all the PFAS, it's going to be a pretty daunting task, because the lower molecular weight ones are very difficult to remove, whether it be by activated carbon or be by an exchange. When you get up to the higher molecular weight ones that are in the regulation, now you're going to see your costs drop dramatically, simply because they're easier to remove. But this is just an example. These costs do vary, but to put them in some perspective, I would say if you walk away from here and say about 20% savings, that's pretty common. So to recap, you need time to absorb the contaminant, and that's why the highways, the transport pores are really important. That's what's driving PFAS removal and performance for PFAS removal. With reactivation, we can have a material that performs similarly, if not in some cases better than the virgin material, at least through the first reactivation cycles. We can see 4 log destruction if we talk about all PFAS compounds in that study. At an industrial level, we can see 5 if we look at just the regulated materials or regulated compounds. About 20% savings on reactivation. And key thing there is really that last point, is that disposal during reactivation really isn't disposal exactly, it's reuse of the material. And as best we can see right now, the thermal destruction of the PFAS compounds remains viable, just as we've applied it for all other, many other chlorinated and fluorinated compounds that we've been removing really for decades and sending through reactivation. So at that point, I will pass back to Callie, and she can talk about the next talks.
Thanks so much, Adam, and special thanks to all of our speakers who are on, and to everyone who's stuck with us. I know we're a little bit over time. We don't have a ton of time for questions, but did want to call out again, just as a reminder, you'll get the link for the recording later this week. Any questions that we didn't have time to answer on this particular call, we'll send you those answers after we get all of the questions fulfilled from all of the speakers. And then if you did want a PDF version of the slides that we are allowed to share with you, please send us an email at foundation@wqrf.org, and we'll send those over to you. One really quick question, we have several, but I'm going to go to the ones that are the easiest here. What % reduction of PFAS is expected with water treatment, GAC or RO versus ion exchange? And I'll toss that one to Adam if you can respond to that one.
Yeah, it depends if that's an answer. If you're looking at any time or at the beginning of the life of the media, there's going to be 100% removal. It's really difficult to say what the percentage removal is, because whether it be ion exchange or be activated carbon, it's 100% removal until breakthrough. It's certainly a different situation with RO, where you have some amount that could end up not going through, or excuse me, going through and not ending up in the reject water. I can't speak to that because I'm not an RO expert, but it should be very similar to the activated carbon and the ion exchange, except that you're going to have, of course, more permeability of the lower molecular weight compounds. But for IX and GC, it's 100% removal until initial breakthrough. It always parses out based on, or separates out based on, the molecular weight. But it's kind of a difficult question to answer, but I'll leave it at it depends, and 100% until it's not.
Thanks, Adam. I appreciate that. I do see that David is responding to an answer, or responding to a question in the chat. So thanks, David. One other question, as long as we have some EPA specialists on the call here, are there any incentives, particularly for small water treatment companies, to prioritize GAC reactivation versus landfill disposal?
So I would just say from a policy perspective, no, there are no, particular incentives. I think water systems will need to try and figure out what's going to work best for their, facility based on a number of different factors, like the water quality characteristics, cost, and other things. But there are no specific incentives, to at this time for reactivation versus landfill. I will say, if you take a look at some of our very technical support documents that go along with the proposed rule, we are anticipating that many systems will choose reactivation over landfilling. So that's something that, we've concluded. And again, you can take a look at a very extensive information. All of it's available on the drinking water, PFAS drinking water regulation website. And I will invite, Cindy or Stanley, both from EPA as well, if there's anything else like really quick to add to that, but I think that's kind of the high level response.
And in our follow-up email, we'll make sure to include any of the links that were shared within the context of all of these presentations will be included in that follow-up email as well, just so that you have a reference document and easy access to all of those links. Really quickly, as you can see here on the screen, our next summer school session is coming up on July 23rd. And actually wanted to also include that WQRF is working on some of these things that we did talk about today, specific to research and PFAS. So on July 23rd, join us to hear a little bit about our PFAS surrogate research project, which is being conducted with researchers at the University of British Columbia. Very excited to share the results of that study, so join us July 23rd for that. And additionally, wanted to just inform everyone here that we are actually working on a research project as well to research spent PFAS retention on spent media with Purdue University. The results of that particular research project will not be completed until 2025, but we're excited to see what comes from those landfill conditions studying already spent PFAS media. So that is it for the day. Apologies that we're a little bit over time. Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you on July 23rd. Have a great rest of your day. Special thanks to all of our speakers for joining us. Take care. Bye-bye.